tackling tough topics to help you think reasonably about life's most important issues. This is Thinker Sensitive.
Well, thank you guys for having me. Excited to be here. Like I said, I'm Nina Vetter with the city. I've been working on this project for, I think Chris and I were talking about it, I think over 3 years. We've already been working on this. So I'm going to start by saying we have a lot of information. There's some handouts. I'm going to go through a lot of information in the PowerPoint, but all of the information I'm presenting and that's in the handouts is available online. So if you want more materials, please visit our website. It's coloradosprings.gov/renewnnav. You can also find there literally every single piece of input we got in this process. So if you want some reading in the evening with your glass of wine, feel free to check out the website. Okay, so I'm going to go through an overview of the entire project, but like Sean said, feel free to ask questions at any point. I'm happy to. So first things first, what is North Nevada Avenue? So to some people, North Nevada is, maybe through the old North End, right? Maybe north of Austin Bluffs, where University Village is, all those new shops up there. But to us, this is our project area. So it goes just south of Fillmore, all the way up to Austin Bluffs. Geographically speaking, that is what we call in our project North Nevada Avenue. Now, have any of you heard of this project before today? Has anyone been involved in it at all? Any meetings, surveys? Well, shoot. That's too bad. Like I said, this is a geographic area. The way the actual plan and recommendations are laid out, if you want to take a look at our nice long master plan, are 3 different sectors. So obviously you're all familiar with this neighborhood. You know that there's a big power plant right in the middle. There down south, you have Navajo Hogan. You have a lot of great kind of local bars. And then up north, you have some kind of strip malls. You have that Kapow Coffee and Comics, right? You have a car repair shop. So the corridor feels a little bit different in different areas, right? Like when you're driving by the Birdsall power plant, that doesn't feel like the same area as when you drive by or walk by Navajo Hogan, right? They feel inherently like different neighborhoods. So the recommendations that you'll see are broken out into 3 sectors to try to reflect the fact that we have really different components in this neighborhood, and really they're like 3 separate neighborhoods all in one corridor. Okay. First things first. So we worked on a master plan. It was actually approved by City Council in March 2017. And the goal of the master plan, again, you can read it online, or if you want to visit this version here, some light reading, feel free to do so. But what we wanted to focus on is what uses are appropriate for the area. So like I said, you have the power plant, you have some really heavy industrial, you have transit mix, you have the old dog track. I'm sure you're all familiar with that really large parcel there. You have a national cybersecurity center, you have mobile homes, right? So there's a lot of very different uses, all commingled into one neighborhood. And so one of the key things we wanted to look at is what uses are appropriate. Do you guys remember over on North Nevada Avenue if there's sidewalks through most of it? None, right. Very few, there's pieces of sidewalk here and there. Very little sidewalk, no curb and gutter, really poor drainage in the corridor as well. So we wanted to look at what infrastructure is needed to improve the area. Thirdly, how do we incent current businesses to expand? And then bringing in new businesses. So when I talk at the end about next steps for us moving forward, you'll hear a little bit more about that. And then fourth is to build on existing opportunities. Has anyone visited Tap Traders yet? Yes. Tap Traders is a really cool reuse. The Alexander, I always say it wrong, I think it's Alexander Film Studio used to be where Tap Traders is. Anyone know about that story? Before there, it was actually an aviation facility. So there's some really cool history. If you go into Tap Traders, you'll actually see pictures of the old film studio and even some of the old infrastructure from the film studio as well. So it's a really good example of using kind of the history of this corridor to your advantage. I don't know if you know this, but before I-25 was built, North Nevada was our highway. Which is obviously reflected by some of the old motels you see there. Again, some of the industrial, right? There's a reason why it looks the way it is today and it's developed that way is because it was our highway back in the day. Okay, so in the master planning process, let's see, I'm gonna go forward. We had over 900 people participate, and I'm bummed you guys weren't part of it. But there's still opportunity to get involved, don't worry, there's plenty more to be done. But we were excited to have that many people participate in just planning for one neighborhood. We did an online survey. We held a series of, I think, 5 community workshops, and you'll see this is a picture from the workshop. We had about an average of 100 to 200 people show up to each of our meetings. And we really asked for their input. So based on all of those meetings and the feedback that we got online, we came up with our project vision that split into 4 different areas. So what was really important to people was how do we move in the corridor? So we talked about the lack of sidewalk, curb, gutter. But you also probably don't see a heck of a lot of people biking along North Nevada, right? Doesn't feel very safe. We don't have transit on there either. So it was important for people to have improved connections, improved access, and to have better trail connections. Are you familiar with the Templeton Gap Trail up there? Right, it's kind of a bummer that you have to cross North Nevada at that one point. So you'll see in our recommendations, trying to do some kind of underpass to address that connection. Hopefully, someday we can get that built. So how we move is very important to people. Another important piece was how do we live? So there's actually not a lot of housing along North Nevada Avenue. There are some mobile home parks on the west side of North Nevada Avenue. There's a few houses on the east side, but it's mostly, again, industrial, some commercial, very little housing, and people felt like there's an opportunity for a lot of housing in here. It acts as this connector between the Old North End, the downtown, and UCCS, right? There's an opportunity for some great housing. It's a great location. We need more housing in here. Also having accessible restaurants, shops, stores, there's nothing really, not a heck of a lot to visit right now, other than Top Traders, a few businesses. There's no grocery stores. There's no real convenience stores in that area. And again, street sidewalks, all those improvements. The third area was how do we work? People want to create a mix of business types, recognize historic businesses, and facilities that support the needs of UCCS. And then last but not least, how do we look and feel? If you look at the public input that we got and the comments we received, one of the most common concerns was safety. That got brought up a lot. It doesn't feel safe here. So working on making it a clean and safe corridor, having green spaces are just amenities that people can enjoy and can actually spend time in the corridor. Because right now, unless you're visiting a very specific business, you're not really going to go for a stroll in the corridor, right? You're not going to hang out there. So kind of improving on that as well. So that's an overview of the vision. There's more about the vision in the master plan and online if you want to dig into a little bit more. But the master plan itself, what was important to us is that this isn't just a planning document that sits on a shelf. We're like, hey, we did this. This is what people said we wanted. We wanted to make sure we could actually implement this and create change in the neighborhood. It was funny, asking 900 people for input is a really interesting experience because you get a lot. Actually, it was really interesting to see people say, we want stuff like University Village, we love that, and then the next person says, I don't want that, I want all local businesses, right? So it was funny to get a really interesting mix of comments, but what was consistent was people wanted change. We got very few comments like, don't touch a thing, just leave it exactly like it is, right? So everyone wanted some form of change. This is, what is that change? Wasn't necessarily, the same across the board. So to us, kind of understanding that 900 people told us they want change, like, we got to make this happen. So in the master plan itself, we put in at the end recommendations on how to actually implement this. So how do we make this vision happen, right? With this nice vision, we want to improve the corridor. How does this become a reality? And the first recommendation was to prepare a zoning overlay ordinance. Does anyone know what that means? Any planning nerds? Okay. One. Well, I know that. We'll talk about that in a minute. It does matter. It's very important, especially if you're a business owner or own any buildings. And then I'm going to talk about 1 and 5. That's why they're highlighted here. But we also wanted to prepare a transportation plan. So we're missing sidewalks. We want to improve our trail connections. How do we do that? What does that look like? How do we get prepared to propose funding to try to get this done? So there's actually 10 recommendations. I didn't list them all here. Again, feel free to look at it if you want to see all of them. But to us, the 1 and 5 are things that the city controls and that the city can really make happen. So for us, that was really where we wanted to focus our energy moving forward. So remember, this is back in 2017 when it was approved, and we noticed we need to do 1 and 5. This needs to happen. So we're going to talk about zoning overlays. It's my favorite topic. We're very fortunate to have Chris here today from our planning department who works in this geographic region. So if you want to talk more planning, Chris is here. So Chris, wave your hand. There he is.
Howdy.
So anyone want to give a stab at like what they think a zoning overlay might be? I might have to call in John. Yeah?
Pretty much like you have zoning areas and everywhere, and it's like there's zone for business, there's zone for residential, there's zone for school.
Yeah, very good. So we have zoning, which provides context on what you can and cannot build or operate on a certain parcel. And Chris, correct me if I get all my planning words wrong, because I'm not a planner by nature. And what we really wanted to do was, there's a few options. You can go in and hard rezone and say, okay, you were C1, which is a commercial. We now want you to be residential. So now you've been rezoned, right? We didn't want to do that. So a zoning overlay adds a layer on top of your current zoning. It doesn't change what you're zoned for currently at all. It adds another layer on top. The overlay was not to force businesses to change what they're doing, force them out, but to encourage when someone wants to redevelop or when a business leaves and there's an opportunity for redevelopment. Okay, now that there's an opportunity, now we have this overlay, and here's what we're looking for moving forward. Does that make sense? It's my basic overview of overlays. So what the actual overlay says, what we're trying to do is orient buildings towards the street. Why does that matter? You want to take a stab at that? Why does it matter to orient buildings towards the street instead of maybe to the back, to the side? Yeah, easy access. Exposure. Yes. And it makes it more friendly to pedestrians, right? So if you're walking by a building, let's say where the entrance maybe is in the back, and you just have this big blank wall, it's not very welcoming, right? We wanted to foster mixed uses, encourage multi-story buildings, promote aesthetically pleasing building design. And I'm really excited about this next bullet point. We really want to incorporate sustainable places and landscaping, including public art, public spaces, LEED certified building design, and then minimize visibility and impact of parking lots. I'm sure you're familiar with the Kmart parking lot. It's rather large, right? Again, that doesn't encourage pedestrian accessibility. It's not necessarily an area where you really want to walk. It's not the most attractive, it's concrete, right? Not the most attractive place to walk by. So going back to that vision, right? People wanted this clean, safe, attractive, walkable, vibrant neighborhood. In order to do that, we need to have new businesses, expanding businesses, start to develop in this way, right? So that helps us achieve our vision. So when you think about neighborhood redevelopment, a lot of people are like, oh, what's the city going to do to fix it? Who do you think makes a bigger impact, the city or the private businesses there? Yeah, I mean, we both contribute, but the private businesses and how they develop make a huge impact on a neighborhood. And the overlay allows us to encourage people to develop in a way that meets that vision that the neighborhood said they wanted. So a little bit more on overlay. There's 3 key parts to it. I just talked a little bit about what the goals were, right? And you'll see that reflected in the design guidelines, which talk about orienting buildings towards the street, right? Those kind of design elements. There's 2 other really key things. Setbacks. Who knows what setbacks are? Yay, we got one person. What are setbacks? Yes, exactly. And why do those matter? Exactly. Yeah, so the further you are away from the street, again, you're going to have that same issue of pedestrian accessibility, walkability, so setbacks matter. The second is land uses. So we talked a little bit about zoning, right? So that's what's another key piece of the zoning overlay is a very large, long zoning table, if you want to look at it, where we talk about what uses, again, only when you redevelop or expand, what uses we want to see moving forward in the corridor. It was really interesting, if you're familiar with zoning at all, if you look at the corridor right now, it's mostly zoned M1, M2. Anyone want to guess what that might be? Yes, it's a heavy industrial? Is that
Heavy industrial.
Heavy industrial. So you can't build residential there, right? Can't build a restaurant, can't build a shop, right? It's only zoned for heavy industrial. So our overlay allows a lot more uses than we're currently allowed in the corridor based on the current zoning. It also does restrict some too. I will say that. But I can answer any questions you might have on that. So those are really three of the key parts to the overlay document. I won't go through this. These are the setbacks. And these are some of the uses that we wanted to encourage that aren't currently allowed in our current zoning. So things like multifamily dwelling, bless you, hotels, mixed use, some of the things I already mentioned. And then, like I said, we are restricting some uses moving forward, so I don't want to hide that piece. I think it's important to call that out. There are fewer things we're restricting than we are allowing, you will notice. A lot of them you'll see contractor yards, mining operations, some of the heavier industrial type businesses. And here's the catch. So here's where the overlay we talked about earlier comes into effect, right? So you keep your base zoning, right? Whatever you're zoned, you're zoned. When does the overlay then come into effect, right? You're not touching my zoning, so how does this come into play? It only comes into play in certain circumstances. And essentially, if you're one of those, let's go back here. Let's say you're one of these uses that on our zoning table is no longer allowed. What does that mean? You can continue to operate and you can perform regular maintenance and repairs. You can't expand beyond 50% or the overlay comes into effect. And if you discontinue their use and redevelop, again, the overlay comes into effect. So again, our goal was to allow the businesses to continue to operate, regardless of if they're currently allowed in the zoning overlay, but really to encourage when someone redevelops to try to redevelop in this way. Does that make sense? I know it's a lot of zoning. Oh, okay. All right. And we do have, in addition to an overlay, design guidelines. And that provides a little bit more on how to develop a business that meets our goals. So we talked about buildings facing the street, rooftop treatments, screening mechanical equipment, right? Things that you might not necessarily think of, but if you think of attractive neighborhoods or buildings you've walked by, you probably aren't seeing a heck of a lot of mechanical equipment just hanging out, right? And again, the building height bonus, which we think is really great for affordable housing, public art, LEED building design. We really want to encourage things like that, and one of the ways we can do that is to give people building height bonuses if they incorporate these things in their development. There's also some regulations regarding parking and access and signage and lighting if you're interested in that as well. Okay, whew, it's a lot about zoning. Does anyone have questions on zoning? Because I'm going to move on to transportation if not. Yes?
Has this been implemented in the city elsewhere, like for instance around South Nevada area?
Good question. So we do have some other overlays, but they're not necessarily used in this way. One that I think is maybe the more similar that we have is probably form-based code in our downtown. And that is a large document around how to build in a certain way. And you can really see that reflected if you ever go downtown. You can kind of see consistency in how far back the buildings are, right? That form-based code provides a lot of guidance. That's probably the best example. On South Nevada, it's actually a little different. So when we started working in North Nevada, there's no, developer who came in and said, hey, I want to do this project, or a few developers, here's my plan. Let's make it an urban renewal area and let's move forward. We don't have that. In the South Nevada area, a few developers actually approached us and said, we want to work on this project. It was designated as an urban renewal, what's it called? Area? Authority. District, thank you. And then the district actually implemented design guidelines. So usually it's when we designate an urban renewal district that we actually create the design guidelines. So this isn't as common in the city to do a zoning overlay. It is more common in other cities than it is here. And it's actually this one's unique. You can't really point to another one like this in the city. It's a little bit different than what we've done in the past. So. And it's been interesting since the master plan was approved, and then the overlay and the accompanying design guidelines were approved by council earlier this year. Since they've been approved, we've been approached by a lot of local business owners about wanting to do something different with their properties and wanting to redevelop. So it's been interesting to see the interest that pops up when we start doing things like this. So a lot of the signage refers to our existing sign regulations that were just updated in city code. We also say that We encourage pedestrian scale wayfinding signs, as well as kind of the large, you can see by driving signs. So that's it on signage, so not a heck of a lot. On lighting, we also talk about having lighting that's pedestrian in scale and directed down to reduce glare and spillage, and kind of low glare lighting. Again, trying to encourage pedestrian walkability. If you have the lights that kind of shine out and are intended to be kind of lights for when you drive by, that's not the same as having the pedestrian scaled lighting that points downward that you can follow if you're walking along. And we do say that exterior lighting after store closing should be minimized. That's it for not a heck of a lot on signage and lighting. Okay, so another big piece is transportation and infrastructure. What we heard from the community, again, through these meetings and through our own traffic engineering division, is that we need improved roadway connections. I'm sure you all have experienced, you can go really fast from Fillmore to, I can't remember where the first light is, right? But there's no real lights, and you can floor it, and then I'm sure none of us ever do that, right? We talked about the lack of sidewalks, and people continue to tell us that there is a need for transit, right? There's a continued need for and good transit, frequent and accessible transit. So those are really the themes that we heard regarding transportation. So this is called a street cross-section. Can you guys see it back there? Sort of? Okay. So you'll see here what we're anticipating in terms of transportation on the corridor. And a really interesting thing that we're working on is the railroad has right-of-way along North Nevada Avenue that we are purchasing, the city is purchasing. Now that gives us a lot of right-of-way to work with, which is really an opportunity and an asset. So in a lot of streets where you don't have a lot of width or you don't have any excess right-of-way, right, you have maybe a few lanes and then you have private property right off the side, you don't have a lot of room for things like a dedicated transit lane. Well, here where we already have, you probably have noticed how wide North Nevada is, and on the sides, lacking sidewalk, curb, and gutter, you'll just see kind of like the dirt on the sides, right? That's actually our right-of-way as well. And then we're purchasing more, right? So we're gonna have a lot of right-of-way to work with. So what we're proposing, again, this is done through the community, is a dedicated transit corridor and also a dedicated wide trail along North Nevada Avenue, pending the completion of our purchase of the right-of-way. This also does change as you move through the corridor. So if you look at the transportation plan or the master plan, you'll see that, for example, the railroad right-of-way doesn't go the whole length of the corridor. So this cross-section is for the center of the corridor where you have that access right-of-way. But if you look north and south, you'll see that this looks a little bit different. But it keeps with kind of the 2 lanes, bike infrastructure, et cetera. So a little bit more background on how we approached the transportation plan. So conventionally, when you think about traffic and traffic congestion, what do we tend to do usually? More lanes, ding, 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 yes. So what we wanted to look at is, we do have some traffic in the corridor, but we wanted to look at how do we, instead of just saying we need to add more lanes, how do we look at moving more people, not just cars? How do we improve the quality of the travel? And so you'll see that there's just a few, focusing on transit, focusing on ped and bike, and also access was a really big thing that came up as well, because it's important to continue to provide good access to businesses. Access is a very important part of transportation, especially for our local businesses. So access is also a huge part of this. The firm that we hired to do our transportation plan, Kimley Horn, had this guy come up, and I thought this was really great. He talked about 500-foot blocks. So there's this kind of theory in the transportation field where people won't walk more than 500 feet, typically, to get somewhere. Does anyone know where that may have come from? Can you think of an example where you may be parked and then walked into something? A mall, yes. So most malls, the parking lot rim is about 500 feet, and that's based on that theory of your people are willing to walk about 500 feet. So we have a lot of really large blocks on North Nevada, right? So one of the things that you'll also see in the transportation plan is when people redevelop, can we focus on getting those shorter, maybe close to 500 feet blocks that we really need to create that pedestrian environment. So you will see in the plan there's specific recommendations on intersection improvements. There is limited east to west access. If you ever drive around there or try to get around in the back roads, there's only a few roads that can take you east or west. So you will see some of that. The other really interesting thing is whenever there's an accident, right, or something happening on I-25, everyone jumps on Nevada, right? So one of the things that you'll see on there is we're going to try to connect Cascade to Mark Dabbling. Does anyone know where that is? So Cascade's kind of on the west side there. There actually used to be a bridge that went over the creek that was wiped out in, I want to say it was the flood in the early 1900s, I think it was. So what we want to do is reestablish that bridge so that there is another north-south route other than Nevada. So you actually would be able to access Austin Bluffs via Cascade and then up Mark Dabbling. Just try to provide some kind of relief when that does happen. Because again, if we're going to slow down traffic, right, if we're going to encourage pedestrian access, we will be slowing down the traffic on North Nevada. So having some other option long-term is really, really positive for the area. And again, third, I talked about transit and working on our trail connections as well. So these are the actual recommendations that came out of the transportation plan. Again, you'll see access management down there as well. There's a lot of minor intersection improvements, lighting things that you can look at as well if you're interested in the more technical traffic areas. It's not my expertise. And this is the block building. So I talked about the 500 feet. It was really cool to see this visual because you can see the length of the current blocks and then some kind of just concepts, right? We're not asking people to necessarily do this, but concepts on if we did have blocks that were about 500 feet in the blue, that's what our blocks would look like in the future. So the power plant's not going anywhere. Our Birdsall power plant is very important of utilities infrastructure, so it will be staying. So you'll see right here, this is the power plant. So we do not anticipate building a block in between the power plant. That's just not going to happen. But then you'll see north of it, we do have some other potential blocks built in. Right here is the dog track parcel. So you can see how big that is, right? This shape right here. That's pretty large. And again, it's not going to happen today, right? It's not going to happen until that property owner decides to do something different with it. And then we can have a conversation about, hey, here's what our community wants. And also, maybe we can work on some blocks within here, right? So this is really intended to be when someone comes to the table with, hey, I want to do something different, you know, we're prepared to have these conversations about here's what our community said they want and here's what it looks like, theoretically speaking. And these are just concepts, so it wouldn't necessarily be, you know, a block exactly right here, but conceptually speaking, it would be nice. You'll see the same thing at the Kmart site too, right? So right now, without the blue boxes, it looks like this. Right, so we want to encourage some roadway network within the Kmart site as well. And we're working with them on that. So, you know, whether it's a public street or whether it's a private street, those are conversations that we can have about how exactly we can make it work. The plan doesn't specify, you know, it needs to be public or it needs to be private and owned by the business and maintained by them. It gives us some flexibility so that we can have those conversations about what's going to work for them. So, and ultimately, it really is up to the property owner. I mean, at the end of the day, we're relying on them to come to the table, work with us, say we have this master plan that had 900 people involved. Here's what it looks like. How can we work together to get as much done as we possibly can towards those goals? So, you know, and we are trying to work proactively with our property owners up here as well. We're not just waiting back and seeing who's going to show up at our door. So we're working with a lot of the businesses in the area. One of them is Comcor. I don't know if you're all familiar with them. But they provide rehabilitation services for those coming out of our correctional institutions. And so we're working with them. They own actually 5 buildings on the corridor, and they're kind of scattered about. They look kind of like old motels without a sign, so you probably would recognize some of them. So we're trying to work proactively with people. But, you know, we're also trying to be respectful of the business owners and the property owners that we have in this area because we do want this to be a partnership. And that's really what we've said from the beginning. We're not going to come in and say you must do X, Y, Z. This is not going to work. And that's not the way we want to operate. So we have a master plan, we have a zoning overlay, design guidelines, a transportation plan. What's next? Money, hey, yes. So you're going to give us some? Is that what you're saying? No, just kidding. One of the things that we actually need to work on next is transit. So we identified in the master plan that people want accessible, convenient, frequent transit services. But what does that actually look like? And a lot of transit projects are built with federal dollars, not with local dollars. And when you use federal dollars, you have to go through a process called a transit alternatives analysis. And what it does is it looks at where you're trying to put transit, where exactly should it go, and what form of transit should it be? Should it be a modern streetcar, an old streetcar, a bus, light rail, bus rapid transit, right? There's a lot of different types of transit that you could do, but this transit alternatives analysis that the federal government requires also allows us to identify that. So later this year, we will be contracting with someone, I think the RFP is out right now, to undertake that, and there is a public piece of that. So I encourage you to get involved with that. We will have meetings about the transit service specifically in this corridor, but again, this is different for us because we don't have a dedicated transit lane anywhere in our city. Okay, so this is the first time we're talking about doing this, really doing this. So this is a huge step. So identifying what that service looks like, how frequent is it, what kind of transit, that's a huge decision to make. What form is it that we want to put in there will be a really important conversation. So I encourage you to get involved when we have actually established some meetings, hopefully later this year and early next year. But that's a really important next step for us. That's it. Other next steps. So I told you I would loop back to a few other things. So the transit alternatives analysis, I told you we're going to be working on the design to implement this next, right? So we should be doing that this year and next year. The really challenging piece, as you alluded to, money, right? Doing this infrastructure that we want to do takes a lot of money. So we are working on identifying how we can fund that. It will possibly be with PPRTA funds. Anyone know what PPRTA is? Pikes Peak Regional Rural Transportation Authority. I always want to say regional, it's rural. Regional Transportation Authority. And they fund a lot of our big capital projects. It's not usually the city that's able to fund that because those are multi-million-dollar projects. It's usually the PPRTA. So we will likely be asking them to fund this project. It probably won't happen realistically for at least 4 years, right? So we got some time. But again, we need to get that design done first because we can't even ask for money if we don't have that design done. So that's a really important next step. The other next step that we're working on right now is economic development incentives. So I talked about that at the beginning. How do we incent people to do what we want them to do, essentially? So we will be bringing forward incentives to City Council later this year that will encourage people, again, to develop in this way that supports the master plan. It includes things like waiving of fees. I think it has a quicker turnaround time on reviews, things like that that just ease the process of redevelopment. So those are really our next few steps. And again, the transit study really is going to be the next step that has the most public input when we really need people to participate in that process. So that's that. Did I have another one? No, I didn't. Okay. Whew. I think before you see the infrastructure come in, you will see some redevelopment. Like I said, we're working with the Kmart property owners right now on potential projects on their site. We've had a few other property owners come in and talk to us. So I think you'll see a few projects start to happen. Some redevelopment's going to start to happen on this corridor before we're able to get the infrastructure in place. Because I think that's at least 4 or 5 years out for us to actually improve the infrastructure the way we want to. So, but and it's largely up to the market. So we'll see what happens. I think you're going to see things start to happen the next few years, and I think 5 to 10 years from now, North Nevada is going to look a heck of a lot different than it does today. It's going to take time. I mean, it's not going to happen tomorrow, but it will happen over time. So, and the important thing for us is it's not just about, we want redevelopment, right? We want it to look nicer. It's about encouraging redevelopment to follow the master plan, because this is what the community said they wanted. And that's what we want at the end of the day, is not just people to come in and build a new thing, right? We want them to do something that meets what the community said they wanted. That's really what our goal is long-term from this project. So, I don't know if anyone's heard of the not called that, opportunity zones that the federal government recently implemented. So it's a little complicated, but essentially if you have any capital gains that you don't want to get taxed on, if you invest in an opportunity zone, you can lower the amount of tax you pay or not pay any tax at all. North Nevada is within an opportunity zone. So what that does is provides anyone who wants to invest a geographic area specifically to invest in. We've already had one person come to us and say, I heard, I'm interested, let's do North Nevada, let's talk about projects. So that's actually a really great opportunity if you're, if that's appropriate for you. The state also has a program, and I'm not super familiar with it, but I can provide you some information, like how to find it online, in the county as well, that provides some tax incentives for opportunity zones, which North Nevada is. So there are some other options out there. So there are a few public projects. So one is on the Kmart site, there will be a hotel coming in on where the big train is, as well as a restaurant next to it. So that's one of the current public projects. The other one is a gas station. Do you know where it is, Chris?
Where?
The Come and Go? Do you remember where that is?
No, Mike mentioned it. Yeah, there was the hotel and the Come and Go.
Yeah, those are our two current, approved, or in the works. There has been a development application received. Everything else is just conversations about potential things. But those are really the only firm projects that have come to us. There have been some things like, I don't know if you've heard of the Colorado Hostel that just opened. So that's actually, so they didn't come to us because they're actually leasing a building, and it's the same use because it was a motel. So there is a new hostel. So things like that can happen too, where, if it's a big redevelopment, it will come through city planning, it will come through us. If it's something like that, where it's the same use and it's just a lease and it changes hands, we might not necessarily know about it unless we're out here. But those are our current projects that we're aware of that we know are coming. But places like Navajo, Hogan, the Alexander Film Play, they're not going to go away. It's funny to hear, I don't know if I've heard, so many people talk about Navajo going like, don't touch it. I'm like, we won't. People are really passionate about some of the places that we have here and wanting to make sure that they stay. So, we did talk about potentially having another park in this corridor as well. What that looks like, where it goes, and how it gets funded, it's hard to know until we pick a place. But we do have a little bit more flexibility. Parks probably gets some of our largest grants funds of anyone. There are a lot of grant opportunities out there. A lot of them are coming from the state. And so there are more options when it comes to those kinds of functions, but we'll see kind of where we want to have park infrastructure in the future. That will probably determine the funding source. So. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you, Sean. I appreciate it.
For more thinker-sensitive content, visit thinkersensitive.com.